Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. So this happened about 6 months ago, and I'm still getting a kick out of it. I figured you guys might enjoy this tale of petty revenge that turned into something much bigger. For some background, I'm a land surveyor by trade, which means I'm pretty obsessed with property lines and legal boundaries. It's not just my job, it's basically hardwired into my brain at this point. My wife always jokes that I could tell you the exact square footage of any room just by looking at it, and she's not wrong. We bought our house about 4 years ago in a neighborhood that borders a really popular hiking trail and community park. The location was perfect for us since we both love hiking and being outdoors. The house itself was a great deal, partly because of a weird quirk with the property lines that made it less appealing to other buyers. Here's where things get interesting. Our driveway is unusually long, maybe about 150 feet from the street to our garage. But here's the kicker. There's this paved turnaround area at the end of our driveway that looks like it might be public property. When we first saw the house, even I thought it was some kind of shared space or maybe part of the park system. But when I did my due diligence and really dug into the property survey, I discovered that this turnaround area is actually 100% on our private property. The previous owners had paved it to make it easier for delivery trucks and guests to turn around without backing all the way down the long driveway. The weird property line quirk means our lot extends much further toward the park than you'd expect just by looking at it. I knew this could be a problem, so right after we moved in, I installed a small but clearly visible no parking sign at the entrance to the turnaround area. I also put up a discreet private property sign. Nothing aggressive or unfriendly, just clear boundaries. For the first couple years, we had the occasional issue. Weekend hikers would sometimes park there, and I'd usually just knock on their window and politely explain the situation. Most people were apologetic and moved right away. No big deal. But then she showed up. I first noticed her about 8 months ago. This woman in her late 50s driving a brand new white SUV started parking in our turnaround area. Not just once or twice, but regularly, like 2 or 3 times a week. She'd park there and then walk over to the park for what I assumed were her daily walks or exercise routine. The first time I approached her, she was getting her walking gear out of the back of her SUV. I walked over with what I thought was a friendly attitude and said something like, "Hey there, I just wanted to let you know this is actually private property, so if you could avoid parking here in the future, I'd really appreciate it." She looked at me with this expression that I can only describe as amused condescension. She didn't yell or get aggressive, which honestly might have been easier to deal with. Instead, she got this little smirk on her face and said something about how she appreciated my concern for property rights, but that she was sure there was some kind of misunderstanding. She went on to explain that she was the president of the HOA and that she'd been walking in this area for years. She said she was familiar with all the local property situations and was confident that this area fell under some kind of community use agreement. Now, I knew for absolute certain that this was complete nonsense. I've got the full property survey, I've seen the deed, and I know exactly where every inch of my property line sits. But she spoke with such authority and confidence that I could see how someone less sure of themselves might have been intimidated. I told her politely but firmly that I was 100% certain this was my private property and showed her the no parking sign. She just chuckled and said something about how signs don't always tell the whole story and that community spirit should override petty boundary disputes. Then she said the thing that really got under my skin. She looked me right in the eye and said, "I'm actually doing you a favor by keeping the asphalt warm. Unused pavement is wasted pavement." I was so stunned by the sheer audacity of that statement that I didn't even know how to respond. By the time I recovered, she was already walking away toward the trail. Over the next few weeks, she kept parking there regularly. Every time I'd see her car, I'd go out and remind her that it was private property. She'd give me that same condescending smile and make some comment about community cooperation or how she was sure we could work something out. The weird part was that she was never hostile or aggressive. She maintained this fake polite attitude the whole time, like she was dealing with a confused child who didn't understand how the adult world worked. After about a month of this, I decided I needed to take a different approach. I went to City Hall and got a certified copy of my property survey. I also picked up some official-looking private property, no parking signs to replace my smaller ones. The next time I saw her car there, I walked over with the survey in hand. She was just getting back from her walk, and I spread the survey out on the hood of her car to show her exactly where the property lines were. She glanced at it for about 2 seconds, then looked up at me with that infuriating smirk again. "Surveys can be wrong," she said. "And even if they're right, there are things like easements and community rights that override private property claims." I told her that there were no easements on my property and that I'd checked all the relevant records. She just shrugged and said something about how these things were more complicated than I understood. Then she dropped the bombshell that really set everything in motion. She told me her name and mentioned that she was not only the HOA president but also worked as a real estate agent. She said she'd been dealing with property issues in this neighborhood for over a decade and was quite familiar with the local regulations. Now, here's the thing. We're not actually in an HOA-controlled neighborhood. Our house is just outside the boundaries of the main subdivision that does have an HOA. But I didn't correct her on that point because I wanted to see where she was going with this. She went on to explain that as the HOA president, she had certain authority over community property and easement disputes. She said she'd be happy to bring this matter up at the next board meeting to get an official ruling. I told her that sounded great and that I'd be interested to hear what the board had to say. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already looked up the HOA boundaries and confirmed that my property was completely outside their jurisdiction. Over the next couple weeks, she kept parking there and I kept documenting everything. I started taking photos every time I saw her car, noting the date and time. I also installed a small security camera that had a clear view of the turnaround area. About a month later, she approached me while I was doing yard work. She had this triumphant expression on her face and told me she had good news. She said she'd discussed the matter with the HOA board, and they'd unanimously agreed that the parking area should be considered community space for the benefit of trail users. I asked her if she had any written documentation of this decision. She said the board meeting minutes would be available soon, but that she was authorized to speak on behalf of the board in the meantime. Then she told me that she was going to start parking there every day for the next week to establish precedent for community use. She said that if I had a problem with it, I was welcome to challenge the board's decision through the proper legal channels. This is when she made the statement that sealed her fate. She looked directly at me, then turned toward my security camera like she wanted to make sure she was being recorded, and said, "I'm gonna park here every single day this week. If you think your little survey map means more than my authority as HOA president, then tow me. I dare you. In fact, I double dog dare you." She said it with this smug confidence like she was calling my bluff, like she knew I wouldn't actually follow through. Now, I'm generally not a confrontational person. My wife always says I'm too nice for my own good, but something about her attitude and the way she was so blatantly trying to intimidate me just flipped a switch in my brain. Instead of arguing with her or getting angry, I just nodded and said something like, "Okay, I'll keep that in mind." She looked a little surprised that I didn't push back, but she just shrugged and walked away. That evening, I sat down with my wife and explained the whole situation. She was as frustrated as I was, especially since this woman was now essentially threatening to take over part of our property. But here's where my surveyor training really kicked in. Instead of doing something rash, I decided to approach this like a professional land dispute. I was going to document everything, follow all the proper procedures, and make sure I had an airtight case before taking any action. The next morning, she parked there right on schedule. Instead of confronting her, I took photos from multiple angles, noted the time, and printed out a formal notice of unauthorized parking that I placed under her windshield wiper. The notice was very professional and polite. It stated that the vehicle was parked on private property without permission, referenced the relevant property survey, and requested that the vehicle be removed immediately. I also included a copy of the property survey showing the exact boundaries. When she came back from her walk and found the notice, I watched from my window as she read it. She looked around, spotted me watching, and actually waved at me with this big fake smile. Then she crumpled up the notice and tossed it in our trash can before driving away. Day 2 was exactly the same. She parked there in the morning. I placed another formal notice on her windshield, and she crumpled it up and threw it away when she got back. On day 3, I decided to step things up a bit. I printed out a more detailed notice that included specific legal language about trespassing and unauthorized use of private property. I also included a statement that continued parking without permission could result in the vehicle being towed at the owner's expense. When she found this notice, she didn't just throw it away. Instead, she walked over to my front door and knocked. When I answered, she was holding the notice and had that same condescending smile. She told me that she appreciated my concern, but that these notices were unnecessary since she had authorization from the HOA board. I asked her again if she had any written documentation of this authorization. She said the paperwork was still being processed, but that she could provide it soon. Then she said something that really showed her true colors. She told me that she understood I was new to the area and probably didn't understand how things worked in the neighborhood. She said that property disputes like this were usually resolved through community cooperation rather than legal technicalities. She went on to explain that as someone who'd lived in the area for over 10 years, she had certain informal rights that might not show up on a survey. She said that long-term community members often developed understanding about shared spaces that newcomers needed to respect. The whole speech was delivered in this patronizing tone, like she was explaining basic social concepts to someone who didn't understand how society worked. But then she said the thing that really sealed her fate. She looked me right in the eye and said, "Look, I tried to be reasonable about this, but you're obviously not getting the message. I'm going to park here every day from now on. This is my spot now, and there's nothing you can do about it. If you want to keep complaining, you can see me at the next HOA hearing." Then she handed me back the notice and said, "Stop wasting paper on these silly notices. Save the trees." That night, I called a local towing company that specializes in private property removals. I explained the situation to the dispatcher and asked about their procedures for towing vehicles from private property. The dispatcher told me that they'd need to see proof of ownership of the property, evidence that the vehicle was parked without permission, and documentation showing that the owner had been properly notified. I told her I had all of those things and more. She said they could schedule a tow for the next day if the vehicle appeared again. The next morning, I was watching from my window when she pulled into the turnaround area right on schedule. She got out of her car, looked directly at my house, and gave me another one of those fake waves. But this time, instead of just leaving for her walk, she walked over to my front door and taped a handwritten note to it. The note said, "Stop wasting paper on your silly notices. This is my spot now and I'll be using it every day. If you want to discuss this further, you can find me at the next HOA meeting. Maybe by then you'll understand how things work around here." That was it. I'd given her multiple chances to be reasonable. I'd followed all the proper procedures for notification, and she'd essentially just declared war. I called the towing company and told them to come out immediately. Now, here's where my attention to detail really paid off. When I'd researched towing procedures, I'd learned that the type of tow affects the cost significantly. A regular tow for a front-wheel drive car might cost around $150, but a flatbed tow for an all-wheel drive vehicle could cost $300 or more. Her SUV was definitely all-wheel drive, which meant it would require a flatbed tow to avoid damaging the transmission. I made sure to mention this to the towing company. The tow truck showed up about an hour after she'd left for her walk. I met the driver with a folder containing copies of my property deed, the survey showing the boundaries, photos of her car parked on my property, copies of all the notices I'd placed on her windshield, and the best part, a printed screenshot from my security camera showing her daring me to tow her. The tow truck driver looked through everything and just shook his head. He said he'd been doing this job for 15 years and had never seen someone so thoroughly document a trespassing case. Since her SUV required a flatbed tow, it took about 20 minutes to get it properly loaded up. During that time, a few neighbors came out to watch, and I politely explained that someone had been repeatedly parking on my private property despite multiple warnings. Most of the neighbors were sympathetic. A couple of them mentioned that they'd seen the same woman parking there regularly and wondered if she had permission. Right after the tow truck pulled away with her SUV, I went inside and waited. I figured it would take her at least an hour to finish her walk and discover her car was gone. I was right. About an hour and 15 minutes later, I heard a car door slam followed by some very loud and creative language coming from the direction of the turnaround area. I looked out my window and saw her standing where her car had been, looking completely bewildered. She was talking on her phone, and from her tone and gestures, it was clear she was not happy. After a few minutes of phone conversation, she started walking toward my house. I figured this was going to be the big confrontation, so I grabbed my phone to record the interaction and stepped out onto my front porch. She was practically vibrating with anger as she approached. The fake polite mask had completely slipped, and I could see her true personality. She demanded to know where her car was. I calmly explained that it had been towed from my private property after multiple warnings were ignored. She said she was calling the police to report her car stolen. I told her that was her right, but that I had documentation showing the car was parked illegally on my property. Then she made a threat that really showed her character. She said that as HOA president, she had connections with local law enforcement and city officials. She said I'd regret messing with someone who had as much influence in the community as she did. I just nodded and said I understood her frustration, but that the towing was completely legal and justified. About 20 minutes later, 2 police officers showed up. I was still on my front porch and she was standing in my driveway, so they approached both of us together. The first officer asked what was going on. She immediately launched into this story about how I'd stolen her car from a community parking area. She claimed that she had permission from the HOA to park there and that I was harassing her because of some personal grudge. When the officer asked me for my side of the story, I invited both of them up onto my porch and showed them my folder of documentation. I started with the property survey showing that the turnaround area was 100% on my private property. Then I showed them the photos of her car parked there on multiple occasions, the formal notices I'd placed on her windshield, and the note she'd left on my door claiming the spot as hers. But the real game changer was the security camera footage. I pulled up the video on my phone and showed them the part where she looked directly at the camera and dared me to tow her. Both officers watched the video twice. One of them actually chuckled when she said, "I double dog dare you." The second officer asked her if she had any documentation showing she had permission to park on my property. She said the HOA board had given her authorization, but she didn't have the paperwork with her. The first officer asked her what HOA this was, since he wasn't aware of any HOA that had jurisdiction over private property parking. That's when things got really interesting. She started getting flustered and said she'd have to check her records about the exact boundaries of the HOA jurisdiction. I mentioned that I'd researched this issue and believe my property was outside any HOA boundaries, but that I'd be happy to be corrected if she had documentation showing otherwise. The officers looked at each other and I could tell they'd figured out what was really going on. The first officer explained to her that this appeared to be a civil property dispute rather than a criminal matter. He said that if she believed she had legal rights to park on my property, she'd need to pursue that through the appropriate legal channels. He also mentioned that the video of her challenging me to tow her would make it very difficult to claim that she wasn't aware she was parking without permission. The second officer gave her the contact information for the impound lot where her car had been taken. He explained that she'd need to pay the towing and storage fees to get it back. After the officers left, she stood in my driveway for a few more minutes and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head. Finally, she pulled out her phone and called someone, probably the impound lot. From what I could hear of her conversation, she was not happy about the fees. She kept asking if they were sure about the amount and whether there were any discounts available. After she hung up, she looked at me one more time and said something about how this wasn't over. Then she called a taxi to come pick her up. That evening, my wife and I looked up the impound lot's fee schedule online. For a flatbed tow, the initial charge was $300. Daily storage was $45 per day. And here's the kicker. Because she'd been parked on private property and ignored written warnings, it was classified as a negligent trespass tow, which carried additional fees. The total to get her car back that day would have been about $450, but the story doesn't end there. Over the next few days, I did some research into her claims about being HOA president. It turns out she was telling the truth about that part. She was indeed the president of the HOA that covered the main subdivision near the park. However, I also confirmed that my property was completely outside their jurisdiction, which meant she had absolutely no authority over my parking situation. I also discovered something interesting. The HOA had a code of conduct for board members that specifically addressed abuse of authority and bringing the association into disrepute. I put together a formal complaint package that included the security camera footage of her claiming authority she didn't have, copies of the fraudulent notices she'd ignored, and documentation showing that she'd misrepresented her jurisdiction. I also included a statement explaining how her behavior had affected me and requesting that the board take appropriate action. I submitted this complaint to the HOA's management company and requested that it be presented at the next board meeting. About 2 weeks later, I got a call from someone at the HOA management company. They told me that my complaint had been reviewed by the board and that they'd voted to remove her from her position as president effective immediately. They also mentioned that she'd been censured for conduct unbecoming of a board member and that she was prohibited from seeking any board positions for the next 2 years. The best part was that her removal from the board was reported in the neighborhood newsletter, so all the residents in her subdivision got to read about how their former president had abused her authority and ended up getting her car towed as a result. But I still wasn't done. After all this drama, I decided I needed a more permanent solution to prevent future parking problems. I contacted a local fence company and had them install a decorative but sturdy gate at the entrance to my turnaround area. The gate is designed to look nice and welcoming, but it's clearly marked as private property and it's secured with a lock when I'm not expecting guests or deliveries. I also upgraded my security camera system to make sure I have clear coverage of the entire turnaround area. It's been about 6 months since all this happened and I haven't had a single parking problem since then. Word must have gotten around the neighborhood about what happened because I've noticed that even legitimate visitors are very careful to ask permission before using the turnaround area. A few weeks ago, I was at the local hardware store when I ran into one of her former neighbors. He recognized me and mentioned that she'd moved out of the neighborhood shortly after losing her board position. Apparently, the whole incident had made her pretty unpopular with the other residents, and she'd decided to start fresh somewhere else. The neighbor also told me that the new HOA board had implemented stricter guidelines about board member conduct and authority, partly as a result of what had happened with her. So in the end, not only did I solve my immediate problem, but I also helped improve the governance of the local HOA for future residents. The whole experience taught me a valuable lesson about standing up for yourself when someone tries to bully you, even if they do it with a smile and fake politeness. It also reinforced my belief that documentation is everything. If I hadn't kept careful records and gathered all that evidence, the whole situation could have gone very differently. My wife still jokes that I went a bit overboard with the documentation, but I think it was exactly the right approach. When someone challenges you to enforce your legal rights, sometimes the best response is to do exactly that. The final irony is that her car ended up costing her $450 to retrieve from the impound lot, which is probably more than she would have spent on legitimate parking for the entire year. But the real victory wasn't the money or even getting her removed from the HOA board. It was the principle of the thing. She thought she could intimidate me into giving up my property rights through sheer arrogance and fake authority. When she looked into my security camera and dared me to tow her, she probably thought she was calling my bluff. She figured I was just another suburban homeowner who would back down when faced with someone who claimed to have authority and connections. What she didn't count on was dealing with someone who actually understood property law and wasn't afraid to follow through on legal procedures. In her mind, she was probably thinking that even if I did call a tow truck, she could make some calls and get the whole thing sorted out without any real consequences. She probably figured her connections and position would protect her from any serious repercussions. Instead, she ended up learning a very expensive lesson about the difference between actual authority and perceived authority. The whole situation also made me realize how many people probably get bullied into giving up their rights because they don't know how to properly document and respond to these kinds of situations. If I hadn't been a surveyor with experience in property disputes, I might have been intimidated by her claims about HOA authority and community rights. A lot of people would have probably just given in rather than risk conflict with someone who seems so confident and well-connected. But that's exactly why bullies like her get away with their behavior for so long. They count on people being conflict-averse and not understanding their legal rights. The documentation process I followed isn't complicated, but it does require patience and attention to detail. Taking photos, keeping written records, and following proper notification procedures might seem like overkill for a simple parking dispute, but it's exactly what you need to protect yourself when things escalate. I also learned the importance of staying calm and professional, even when someone is being deliberately provocative. If I had lost my temper or responded to her taunts with anger, it would have undermined my position and possibly given her ammunition to use against me. Instead, by maintaining a professional demeanor and focusing on facts and procedures, I was able to let her own behavior speak for itself. The security camera footage of her daring me to tow her was probably the single most important piece of evidence in the whole case. It showed that she was fully aware she was parking without permission, and that she was deliberately challenging my authority to enforce my property rights. Without that footage, it would have been much easier for her to claim that the whole thing was a misunderstanding or that she genuinely believed she had permission to park there. Looking back on it now, I almost feel sorry for her. She'd probably been getting away with similar behavior for years, and she'd developed this sense of entitlement that made her believe she was untouchable. When she told me she had connections with local law enforcement and city officials, she probably believed it herself. People in positions of authority sometimes develop an inflated sense of their own influence and importance. But the reality is that when push comes to shove, property rights and legal procedures matter more than personal connections and political influence. The police officers who responded to her complaint were professional and fair, but they also understood the law. When they saw the documentation and evidence I'd assembled, there wasn't really any question about who was in the right. I think she probably expected the officers to take her side based on her claims about being an HOA president and having community standing. Instead, she discovered that legal authority trumps social authority every time. The most satisfying part of the whole experience was watching her realize that her usual tactics weren't going to work. You could see the moment when it dawned on her that she'd actually miscalculated, and that there were going to be real consequences for her behavior. People like her are used to getting their way through a combination of intimidation, fake authority, and social pressure. When they encounter someone who's willing to stand up to them and follow proper procedures, they often don't know how to respond. In her case, she doubled down on her aggressive approach instead of backing down gracefully, which just made things worse for her. If she'd apologized and agreed to stop parking on my property after the first warning, the whole thing would have ended there. Instead, she chose to escalate the situation and challenge me to enforce my rights. The "I dare you" moment was really when she sealed her own fate. By saying that on camera, she eliminated any possibility of claiming ignorance or misunderstanding. She literally dared me to tow her car, so when I did exactly that, she couldn't legitimately complain about the consequences. The fact that she then tried to report it as theft shows how disconnected she was from reality. She genuinely seemed to believe that her position as HOA president gave her some kind of immunity from normal legal consequences. When the police explained to her that it was a civil matter and she'd need to pay the impound fees, you could see her whole worldview shifting. Suddenly she realized that her authority and connections didn't extend as far as she'd thought. The complaint I filed with the HOA was really just icing on the cake. By that point, I'd already solved my immediate problem, but I felt like there needed to be consequences for her abuse of authority. The fact that she got removed from her board position was probably more damaging to her than the towing fees. She'd obviously put a lot of her identity and self-worth into that position, and losing it was a serious blow to her standing in the community. The requirement that she couldn't seek board positions for 2 years was also significant. It meant that even if she tried to rehabilitate her image, she couldn't immediately return to a position of authority. Having the whole incident reported in the neighborhood newsletter was probably embarrassing, but it also served an important purpose. It let other residents know what had happened and hopefully discouraged similar behavior from future board members. Overall, the whole experience reinforced my belief that the best way to deal with bullies is to stand up to them using proper legal procedures and documentation. Most bullies count on their targets being unprepared or unwilling to follow through with formal complaints and legal actions. When you show them that you're willing to document everything and pursue appropriate remedies, they usually back down pretty quickly. In this case, she didn't back down, which worked out even better for me because it meant she faced more serious consequences for her behavior. The permanent gate I installed has been a great addition to the property. It looks nice, it clearly marks the boundary between public and private space, and it prevents any future confusion about parking rights. I also like knowing that I have comprehensive security camera coverage of the area. It gives me peace of mind and ensures that if similar situations arise in the future, I'll have the documentation I need to address them properly. The neighbor who told me she'd moved out of the area mentioned that the whole incident had become something of a cautionary tale in their HOA. New board members apparently get briefed on the importance of staying within their authority and not overstepping their boundaries. That's probably the best possible outcome from this whole situation. Not only did I solve my immediate problem, but I also helped create a system that will prevent similar abuses in the future. It's been interesting to see how the story has spread through the local community. Every now and then someone will recognize me and mention that they heard about the parking dispute and the towing incident. Most people seem to appreciate that I stood up for property rights and didn't let someone abuse their authority to take advantage of me. A few people have even asked me for advice about similar situations they're dealing with, and I'm always happy to share what I learned about documentation and proper procedures. The whole experience really highlighted the importance of knowing your rights and being prepared to enforce them when necessary. It also showed me how effective proper documentation can be when dealing with difficult people and complex situations. If there's one thing I'd want other people to take away from this story, it's that you don't have to just accept it when someone tries to bully you or abuse their authority. With the right approach and proper documentation, you can often turn the tables on bullies and make sure they face appropriate consequences for their behavior. In this case, she dared me to tow her car, and I'm a man of my word. I just hope she enjoyed that $450 parking fee. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I worked for my local council doing work within the catchment zone of a river. The council office is not near where my work is, and I only occasionally needed to go in, which was a lovely bike journey, but mainly worked remotely. Importantly, when applying for my job, I was told I would not be able to access work vans for the role, and the role was remote with occasional days in the office. It's in my contract that I cannot access work vans, but also there was nothing stating that I needed my own vehicle for work. There was a change in the council, and those in charge are ideologically against work from home, as everyone is better in the office. I was informed I would need to check in at the main office every day. I arranged a meeting and emailed to explain my role and that most of my work wasn't near the office, that I could only do what they wanted if I had a van but didn't think one was available. Meeting was turned down, and the policy stated that all staff must start their shift in their base office. This was during summer, and so I took the opportunity to do what I was told. Office was a lovely 16 miles bike ride from my home/area of work, and I would usually take about an hour and 15 to do it, so head into the office, find a desk, and do the morning admin. Then back on my bike and back on the road to a site, would do an hour or so of work and have lunch, and work for an hour or so more before cycling back to the office and then turning around. I was pretty fit, but the 60+ miles a day was hard at first, but it didn't take too long to get comfy with it, flattish. Did take the bus a few times, but due to locations, requires 2 buses each way. One west that took an hour because it went to every little village on the way, then change in a quicker bus directly north. But that was slower than the bike ride. Took a couple months, but eventually I got asked why I was completing so little work. A lot of accusations were thrown around, but based on my contract communication, where I pointed everything out and direct orders from the top of the organization being followed, I was found to have simply done what I was asked, and then quietly told I could consider my base to be the sites I worked out. Was great being paid to cycle around in the summer. Anyway, thank you for watching.